The gavel fell like a thunderclap, and the courtroom exhaled, as if the air itself had been convicted. Ava Monroe said not yet, while her hands stayed flat on the table like they were pinning memory in place. Daniel Hart said, breathe, and the word felt warm, but it slid across a floor that was already tilting. The verdict etched itself on wood and skull as reporters hissed questions that did not want answers. Ava watched the judge leave, and the silence he left behind smelled like old paper and bleach. Riley Quinn sat in the last row, a 16-year-old girl with a sketchbook like a shield, pretending not to stare. Riley said, "You don't know me," and the whisper chased Ava into the corridor. A forgotten phone vibrated in Ava's bag, a number she had erased a dozen times, refusing to vanish. Marcus Lee stepped from the wall, like he had built it with his patience and his quiet loyalty. Marcus said, "We appeal," but his eyes measured exits before hope. The call finally won, and Ava lifted it like a live wire and heard the past breathe. Eleanor Vale said, "You still owe me the truth," calm and velvet as a blade across silk. Somewhere behind the voice, Jonah Monroe laughed the way a memory laughs when it knows you cannot touch it. The corridor emptied like a tide that forgot how to return, and Ava kept walking, as if distance could sand down the verdict's edge. Daniel said, "You did everything right," and the words arrived like a blanket set gently over a fire. Ava said, "Right does not resurrect the missing," and the sentence turned the hallway colder. Riley shadowed 3 paces back with the stubborn gravity of a moon that refused its orbit. Marcus said, "Media is camping at the steps," while his eyes placed people into neat boxes labeled risk. The phone stayed warm in Ava's hand, a coal she refused to drop. Eleanor said, "There is a letter you have not read," the voice smooth as polished stone, and Ava stopped like the floor had broken. Ava said, "That letter is a grave," and the line went quiet except for breath. The echo of Jonah's laugh tugged a loose thread in her chest until memory pricked through. Daniel said, "We go out the side," and his palms skimmed the air like a blueprint of mercy. Riley said, "You're going to want to hear me first," and the sentence felt like a new door in a wall that had no seams. They reached the landing where a cracked window made the air bite, like a small honest truth. Daniel said, "The press can smell a pivot," and his mouth tilted with weary humor. Marcus said, "Cars on the east side," while his hand hovered near the rail as if steadying fate. Ava said, "Jonah never wrote letters," and the denial sounded rehearsed, a ritual against drowning. The phone lit again with Eleanor's number like a lighthouse you do not trust. Riley said, "He wrote one to me," and the words were a match struck in a room full of paper. Ava turned, and her eyes did not blink for the span of a beat that felt like a year. Daniel said, "Who are you to him?" gentle as a bandage he feared to pull. Riley said, "The part he lost before he disappeared," and the sentence built a bridge Ava did not want to cross. The stairwell hummed like a throat clearing before a confession. Somewhere below, a door slammed, and the sound measured how little time they had. Ava said, "Show me," and the words carried both surrender and threat as if a rope could be both lifeline and noose. Riley unfolded a page where Jonah's name lived in graphite, like a bruise that refused to fade. Daniel said, "We should move first," but his eyes read the drawing as if it were a map to a minefield. Marcus listened to the stairwell, counting footsteps like a metronome of danger. Riley said, "He told me to wait until the verdict," and her voice trembled the way steel trembles under strain. Ava said, "He trusted strangers when he would not trust me," and the bitterness tasted old. The phone finally died and left her palm feeling abandoned. Daniel said, "We are not alone in here," and the fluorescent hum agreed with a flicker. Ava traced a letter shape in the air, as if writing could reverse time. Somewhere Siren gulped the evening, and then swallowed it whole. They spilled through the side door into air that smelled like wet copper and old rain, and the sky pressed low like a warning. Daniel said, "Left to the garage," and the plan felt thin as paper armor. Cameras lurked at the front like wolves that had learned to smile. Marcus said, 4 minutes if traffic is kind, and he did not trust kindness. Riley said, the letter says the velvet blade keeps a ledger of favors, and the phrase cut the temperature in half. Ava said, Eleanor Vale never writes, she erases, and the anger steadied her steps. A bus groaned past, and drowned every thought that was afraid of being heard. Daniel said, we protect you first, and the word we landed like a promise he would try not to break. Riley said, then protect the truth, and she folded the drawing like it was a passport to a country that might not exist. The courthouse doors banged open behind them, and the night swallowed the rest of the sentence. The parking garage echoed with the sound of dripping water and hurried footsteps, each one bouncing like a reminder that time was running thin. Daniel said, stay close, and his arm extended like a barrier woven of instinct and fear. Marcus scanned every shadow, counting breaths, as if math could protect them from what hid in silence. Riley clutched the folded drawing tighter, her knuckles white as if paper could anchor her in this storm. Ava said, he never trusted me, but he trusted you, her words dragging weight like chains she had worn too long. Riley said, because I wasn't supposed to be here, and her stare sliced through the darkness. The garage lights flickered, buzzing with the rhythm of nerves stretched taut. Marcus said, cars ahead, but his voice held the caution of someone who had already mapped escape routes twice. Ava lifted the phone again, its dead screen reflecting her face like a ghost. Daniel said, we find safety first, answers second, but Ava whispered, answers are the only safety I know. They slid into the car, a battered sedan that smelled faintly of leather and fear, its engine coughing awake like it doubted survival. Daniel said, East Side exit, as he gripped the wheel harder than needed. Ava watched Riley in the rearview, the girl's eyes fixed on the drawing as though it breathed. Riley said, he told me I'd know the truth when the gavel fell, and her voice cracked under the weight of prophecy. Marcus said, we can't linger, they'll follow the noise, while his hand hovered near the door handle, as if ready to leap. Ava said, Jonah never planned ahead, not like this, but her pulse betrayed belief. The sedan jerked forward, and the garage spat them into rain that pounded like judgment. Daniel said, we move fast but invisible, but the street outside was lined with cameras, blinking red like eyes that never slept. Ava whispered, he left me a letter once too, and silence answered as the wipers smeared water into ghosts across glass. The car slid through rain-slick streets, neon signs bleeding across puddles like veins of broken promises. Riley said, you think he died, but he didn't, and her voice carried the certainty of someone who had seen ghosts. Ava turned, her jaw locked, and said, don't speak his name like you own it. Daniel's knuckles paled on the wheel, his calm unraveling in the reflection of passing lights. Marcus said, both of you need silence until we are safe, though his eyes betrayed more questions than his words allowed. Riley held out the folded sketch, her thumb rubbing a corner until it frayed. She said he wrote that letter for you but sent it through me. Ava's chest tightened as if each syllable was pulling a thread that might collapse everything she had rebuilt. Daniel said, where do we go then? And Riley answered, where he told me to wait, the place he called the Anchor. The word settled heavy in the car, carving a destination out of fear. They pulled into a dimly lit diner at the edge of the city, its neon sign sputtering like it was choking on its last breath. Daniel said, we won't be followed here, but his eyes checked every mirror twice. The smell of fried food and old coffee wrapped the booth they chose like a disguise. Ava sat rigid, her suit damp, hands flat on the table like a ritual. Riley slid the drawing across, her eyes daring Ava to touch it. Ava said this is not his hand, but her breath betrayed recognition. Hi, Marcus said. We talk quiet, walls have ears, his tone a stone pressed over fire. Riley said, he drew me with you before he vanished, and Ava's eyes flicked to the paper, heart caught between grief and denial. Daniel leaned in, his voice a hush. If Jonah is alive, we'll need to move differently. Ava whispered, alive means betrayed. And the neon flickered as though the world agreed. Coffee cups steamed between them, untouched, their heat wasted in the weight of silence. Ava said he should have come back to me, not to strangers. Her words both wound and accusation. Riley said, he trusted you wouldn't forgive him, and her voice was brittle as glass. Daniel said, this letter changes everything, but we can't let it destroy you both, his tone carrying authority stitched with care. Marcus kept scanning reflections in the window, his silence more dangerous than words. Ava finally touched the sketch, her finger tracing Jonah's name like it could bleed ink. Riley said, he told me to find the velvet blade if anything happened, and the name cracked the room open like a wound. Daniel said, Eleanor Vale, and his whisper was both recognition and dread. Ava's hand trembled, her mask slipping for the first time. She said, then we are already too late, as the diner door creaked and cold night rushed in like a herald. Rain hammered the diner roof like a jury that could not be dismissed. Daniel said, no more stalls, and his voice carried a map folded inside caution. Riley said, the anchor is a storage unit he paid in cash, and her eyes dared anyone to argue. Ava said, Jonah hated locks, and the memory slid under her ribs like a thin knife. Marcus said, cash leaves fewer footprints, while his gaze measured the exits again. A waitress drifted by and pretended not to listen, which meant she heard everything. Ava said, Eleanor keeps ledgers, not secrets, and the name chilled the coffee that no one drank. Daniel said, we split, but his hand stayed on the table, refusing to let the circle break. Riley said, he told me to bring you, not them, and the word them made the booth shrink. Marcus said, then you bring all of us, and his calm felt engineered. Thunder rolled over the neon glare and turned the windows into mirrors. Ava said, we go now, and the four of them rose as one like a verdict finally read. The storage facility loomed like a spreadsheet built to hide grief, its hallways long and numbered. Marcus said, camera dead on the south row, and the fact arrived too fast to be chance. Daniel said, then we use the north, but his tone suggested traps beneath every tile. Riley guided them with a card she should not have, the plastic warm from her palm. Ava said, who gave you that? And the question tasted like betrayal she refused to name. Riley said, Jonah left it taped under a park bench, and the sentence made the air thinner. A red door with 317 painted, crooked waited like an answer with a price. Daniel said, we document everything, and raised his phone like a shield against revision. Marcus crouched to the lock and listened the way a surgeon listens for a failing rhythm. Ava said, this is empty, we stop pretending, and her hands shook just enough to be true. The lock turned, and the corridor lights flickered as if warned. The door groaned and opened onto boxed lives, each one labeled in Jonah's careful block letters. Ava said he planned, and the syllables cracked an old belief in half. Daniel said, evidence first, as he moved to a metal filing crate sealed with brown tape. Riley said, he told me to read only if you said yes, and waited like a fuse that refused to spark. Marcus lifted a ledger bound in black cloth that smelled of dust and deliberate memory. Ava said that isn't his, and reached for it like it might bite. Inside, neat columns listed favors traded for silence, and the name Eleanor Vale repeated like a drumline. Daniel said, photograph every page, and the shutter chirped in quick heartbeats. Riley found an envelope labeled Anchor, and slid it to Ava with both hands. Ava said, I am not ready, and still she broke the seal, because grief never waits. The note inside was short and cruel. Trust Marcus last. Silence stretched until it frayed, and the hum of the hall returned like a whisper that knew names. Marcus said, what does it say? And the question landed heavier than it should. Ava said, we keep moving, and folded the note into her palm where no one could pry it. Daniel said, we can't ignore a warning inside his handwriting, steady but edged. Riley said, he told me the velvet blade cuts by rearranging memory, and the ledger's columns seemed to shuffle. Marcus replaced the book with practiced care and said, we take the crate, not the unit, like he had rehearsed contingency. Ava saw a receipt tucked under the ledger and slid it free. It showed a donation to a victim's fund signed with Eleanor's name. Daniel said, that makes her a benefactor to her own secrets, and the thought tasted metallic. A camera motor whirred somewhere close, and the corridor breathed. Ava said, "We finish, then we burn our footprints," but the floor already felt wet with danger. They stepped into the corridor and found a janitor's cart that did not belong to anyone breathing. Daniel said back inside, but the unit door had already rolled down on its own like a verdict. Riley said, "We are not the only ones who knew," and her voice thinned to a wire. Marcus moved to the cart and touched the mop handle, which clicked like a hidden switch. Ava said, "Stop," but a small camera lens had already blinked awake. A speaker crackled and released a voice smooth as velvet and sharp as law. Eleanor Vale said, "Thank you for inventory," as if the four of them were her clerks. Ava said, "You do not own this truth," and anger steadied the tremor in her hands. Daniel said, "We split duplicates now, and thrust memory cards into pockets like contraband." Riley said, "The anchor is not a place, it is a person," and the words scorched the air. The corridor lights died, and left the exit sign glowing like a red promise. The exit sign bled red across their faces as they ran, and the rain met them like a crowd that had chosen sides. Daniel said, "Garage is burned," and his voice carried a tired edge. Marcus said, "We ghost the river road," while his eyes tallied every camera. Riley said, "The anchor waits if you stop lying," and her words hit Ava like a thrown stone. Ava said, "Lies are tools, not homes," and the truth tasted like rust. They slid into the sedan, and the city smeared past like a memory refusing detail. Daniel said, "We cache the ledger, then regroup," and the plan sounded stitched from fear. Riley said, "Jonah warned me about a trade," and the syllables shook. Marcus said, "What trade?" but he already looked guilty of knowing. The wipers beat time for a confession that would not come. Ava said, "We end this tonight," and the certainty steadied her breath. Sirens flared behind them, then fell away like doubt. The river showed no light, only a dark line that promised a crossing. They parked under a bridge, where the concrete dripped like a slow, uneasy clock. Daniel said, 5 minutes, as he opened the trunk and lifted a lockbox. Riley said, "He called it the Covenant," and the word felt ancient. Ava said, "Jonah never used words he could not spend," and her chest tightened. Marcus said, "Phones in the foil," and collected devices with ritual calm. Riley said, "He wrote that you bargained with Eleanor," and her stare pinned Daniel in the damp light. Daniel said, "I traded her timing, not evidence," and shame pressed the air thinner. Ava said, "You sold my silence to buy my safety," and the sentence did not tremble. Daniel said, "I saved you from an arrest that would have buried you," and his jaw locked. Marcus stepped between them like a human fuse. Riley said, "The anchor is the person who holds the debt," and she took Ava's hand. The river muttered, the way secrets mutter before they flood. A train howled overhead and shook rust loose from the past. They drove to a garden that had survived a fire by refusing to remember it, and the gate clicked like a closing argument. Ava said, "I come here every year," and she touched a plaque bearing names that still ached. Riley said, "He sketched this place from memory," and unfolded a page that matched the stone path. Daniel said, "We are exposed," but he softened as the wind combed the trees. Marcus said, 2 minutes, and watched the street with the calm of a storm wall. Ava knelt and lifted a loose brick where soil smelled like rain and ash. Inside lay a small key wrapped in tape and a note that read, "Ask the archivist." Riley said, "He told me the archivist was the only witness he trusted," and hope stung. Daniel said, "Witness to what?" and the question sounded late. Ava said, "To the night the warehouse burned," and her voice leveled. Marcus said, "We move," but his eyes flicked toward a black sedan idling far off. The garden lights flickered like thoughts deciding to return. They reached a records hall that slept like a cathedral for paper, and the doors opened with the sigh of old hinges. Daniel said, "No alarms," and surprise betrayed respect. Marcus said, "Archivist works alone at night," as if he knew the schedule by heart. Riley said, "He waits for the key," and placed the tape-wrapped metal on the counter. A man stepped from the stacks with the quiet of a librarian who collects storms. He said, "Jonah paid for a file that cannot be copied," and his eyes carried a tired mercy. Ava said, "Show me," and her voice did not ask twice. The folder held photos from the warehouse blaze and a ledger page with a signature that was not Jonah's. Riley said, "That is Daniel's hand," and the room changed temperature. Daniel said, "I signed to pull his name off the payroll," and the admission landed hard. Marcus said, "For the greater good," and the phrase sounded rehearsed. The archivist said, "Someone else paid me more to seal it," and a woman's perfume lingered like a verdict. Perfume became footsteps, and Eleanor Vale emerged with security like punctuation marks. Eleanor said, "Truth belongs to its curator," and the sentence smiled. Ava said, "You curate grief," and the words cut clean. Daniel said, "You promised to leave her untouched," and his failure filled the room. Eleanor said, "I promised to leave her visible," and her gaze did not blink. Riley said, "Jonah is alive," and she held the archivist's eyes until he nodded once. Marcus said, "Then he stays unfindable until this ledger breaks," and his stance hardened. Eleanor slid a photo across the table where Jonah stood in a clinic hallway, alive and thin. Eleanor said, "He is under my protection while he pays his debt," and the mercy sounded predatory. Ava said, "Debt for what?" and her hands steadied on the file. Daniel said, "For the fire I started to end a pipeline," and the room stopped. Riley said, "You burned him into your cause," and the final silence turned sharp. Outside, sirens chose this building and grew louder. Sirens braided the night around the archives, and security moved like punctuation at the end of a threat. Eleanor said, "Return the ledger," and her calm made fear feel provincial. Ava said, "You curate wounds for profit," and the room leaned toward heat. Daniel said, "I lit the fire to end a pipeline," and guilt put gravel in his voice. Riley said, "You lit him too," and the sentence burned clean. Marcus shifted closer to the door with the posture of a plan rehearsed in private. Eleanor said, "He lives because I intervened," and spread photos like alibis. Ava said, "Intervention is not mercy," and her hands flattened on the file. Daniel said, "Charge me, not her," and his eyes begged the future to accept a trade. Riley said, "Trades made us prisoners," and she pawned the memory cards like seeds. The archivist killed the lights, and the room became a cut where choices bled fast. Eleanor said, "Pick the truth you can keep," and the exit sign answered in red. They slipped out on a fire stair that smelled like old metal and wet dust, and the city swallowed them with sirens still chewing. Daniel said, "Clinic first," and guilt drove like a metronome. Marcus said, "I know a back entrance," and the words felt preloaded. Riley said, "He told me to knock twice, then wait," and the rule steadied her hands. Ava said, "If he is alive, he is owed truth," and the syllables cut her careful armor. The clinic glowed sterile and kind like a lie that pays rent. A night nurse blinked at their story and chose mercy with a keycard. Jonah leaned in a doorway, thinner than memory, eyes bright with apology. Ava said, "You left me with ashes," and the past crossed the floor. Jonah said, "I left with a debt Eleanor priced," and his breath trembled. Daniel said, "Blame me," and Jonah only shook his head. Riley said, "The anchor is him," and the hall accepted the weight of that sentence. They crowded into a consultation room, where the clock refused to move, and the blinds cut the light like bars. Jonah said, "Marcus brokered the burn," and silence clipped hard. Ava said, "He warned me to trust him last," and the note finally found its voice. Marcus said, "I diverted the blaze to save people," and his calm tried to weld itself to virtue. Daniel said, "He fed Eleanor the timing," and shame turned the air heavy. Riley said, "You were the constant because you were the architect," and the word constant changed shape. Jonah said, "Eleanor bought my protection with your silence," and his eyes found Ava. Ava said, "You both spent me," and the sentence did not shake. Marcus said, "I chose the greater good," and the phrase broke under its own weight. Daniel said, I will testify, and his hands stopped shaking. Riley said, then we move now, and she pocketed the consent forms like proof. The clock finally clicked, and the future entered the room. They walked into a late-night courthouse where echo and marble conspired to make every choice permanent. I.e., Daniel said, we file an emergency affidavit, and his voice found a spine. Riley streamed evidence to a secured drop, and the signal felt like air. Ava said, name the deals, name the threats, and the ledger breathed under her palm. Marcus said, think about collateral, and the word sounded like a leash. Jonah said, she keeps victims on retainer, and the phrase chilled the ink. The duty judge listened with eyes that knew the cost of truth. Eleanor arrived with counsel and the scent of order, smiling like a verdict minted fresh. Eleanor said, they conflate charity with conspiracy, and her tone curated doubt. Ava said, you recorded repayments with grief, and lifted a page that owned the room. Daniel said, I confess, and the marble accepted the echo. Riley said, we choose visibility over safety, and the stream ticked past fear. The judge said, we proceed, and the chamber inhaled a storm. Eleanor said, dismiss this theater, but her eyes tracked the ledger like prey. Ava said, call the archivist, and the old man stepped forward with a tired mercy. He said, she paid to seal and to unseal, and the admission landed like a crack across glass. Daniel said, I accept charges for arson and fraud, and his voice held. Marcus said counsel, but the judge cut him with a raised hand. Riley said, the victim's fund is a carousel, and the diagram on her screen spun. Eleanor said, truth is an asset class, and she smiled at the word class. Ava said, not tonight, and produced duplicates the room had not expected. Jonah said, I rescind consent to be hidden, and the fluorescent hum turned ceremonial. The gavel rose into the air, and justice reached for a shape it had not worn before. The gavel fell, and the emergency hearing emptied into corridors that smelled like old wax and new fear. Ava said, we are not finished, and the words steadied like a spine sliding into place. Daniel said, charges stand, but so does the record, and his jaw finally unclenched. Riley said, visibility first, and her thumb hovered over a public release she had not yet pressed. Marcus said, press invites chaos, and his eyes counted cameras as if they were exits. Jonah said, I will testify without the screen, and the decision aged him and freed him in a single breath. Eleanor waited near the marble stairs like a queen who had taught storms to kneel. Eleanor said, you have made grief loud, not true, and the insult wore perfume. Ava said, truth is a ledger you cannot curate, and the sentence did not blink. The archivist shuffled past and said, I logged the seal and the unseal, and the bureaucracy became a blade. Riley pressed send, and the night shifted as if gravity had been renegotiated. Outside, sirens softened into distant weather, and the media line frayed under its own hunger. Daniel said, we schedule formal statements, and structure returned to his voice. Riley said, no gatekeepers, and held the mic like it might bite. Ava said, we will name the victims first, and the choice pulled light toward their faces. Marcus said, security perimeter, and placed himself between noise and skin. Jonah said, if I vanish on my terms, and the sentence cut clean through night. Eleanor stepped forward with counsel trailing like punctuation she had purchased. Eleanor said, your narrative omits my rescues, and her smile stacked numbers. Ava said, rescue is not consent, and the line landed hard. Daniel said, I accept prosecution, and the crowd inhaled. Riley said, we will not sell the story, and the microphones blinked like nervous eyes. The city wind shifted and carried a colder promise down the steps. They retreated to the diner that had learned their names by listening to silence. Unlined wall. Ava said, we draw the map from here, and unfolded the ledger copies like weather charts. Daniel said, I will give a full sworn narrative, and his voice found steady ground. Riley said, we create a victims registry that cannot be edited, and her pen started breathing. Marcus said, "Protection for witnesses first," and he outlined roots like arteries. Jonah said, "I record my part without erasing hers," and he met Ava's eyes without flinching. The waitress poured coffee and pretended not to care, which meant she did. Eleanor's photo on a news ticker above the counter rotated through Charity Gallus-like armor. Ava said, "We expose patterns, not just villains," and the room grew warmer. Daniel said, "Tomorrow we petition to freeze her funds," and his planner opened like a doorway. Riley said, "Anchor becomes archive," and she slid a USB across the table. The neon wheezed and then held. At dawn, the clinic's conference room accepted them with disinfected mercy and a long table that knew arguments. Ava said, "We set conditions for Jonah's testimony," and each word snapped into place. Daniel said, "I name my handlers and the payments," and shame arrived as clarity. Riley said, "We stream transcripts to redundant mirrors," and redundancy felt holy. Marcus said, "Routes change every hour," and his pen tapped the map like a heartbeat. Jonah said, "I consent to full name and face," and the decision straightened his thin shoulders. Eleanor called, and her voice glided through the speaker like velvet on glass. Eleanor said, "Withdraw," and the debt ends, and the bribe tried on mercy as costume. Ava said, "Debts end with daylight," and she ended the call. The archivist faxed a notarized chain of custody that sounded like confession and bureaucratic. Daniel said, "We are past the point of private bargains," and the room believed him. By mid-morning, filings hit the court, and the city's feeds carried names that had lived too long in whisper. Ava said, "If justice twists, we keep it visible," and the vow felt like steel warmed by breath. Daniel said, "I will not let my confession become her shield," and his eyes stopped apologizing. Riley said, "We open source the ledger pattern," and transparency became an engine. Marcus said, "I will face inquiry," and the admission softened something hard in the air. Jonah said, "I will testify today," and the present finally outran the past. Eleanor released a statement that dressed control as compassion and invited no questions. Ava said, "We answer anyway," and stepped into noon that did not flinch. The courthouse doors parted for them like a throat about to speak. The judge's clerk nodded, because the work was now larger than any one of them. Riley said, "Anchor holds," and the words felt like a harbor that could survive weather. Morning bled into the courthouse like a slow confession that could not be unsaid. Ava said, "We tell it straight," and the words felt like scaffolding hammered into bone. Daniel said, "I acted, I endangered, and I accept penalty," and the room steadied on his surrender. Riley said, "Victims first," and she read names with a voice that refused to crack. Marcus said, "I chose the greater good and harmed the nearest hearts," and the phrase finally wore truth. Jonah said, "I survived under a ledger," and his breath made the microphones lean closer. The judge watched, with the patience of someone who has learned to count storms. Eleanor sat pristine, a statue sculpted from curated remorse and immaculate poise. Eleanor said, "You weaponized charity against itself," and the sentence glittered like cut glass. Ava said, "You priced suffering and called it rescue," and the gallery rustled like tall grass before fire. The archivist raised a tremoring hand and said, "I logged the buying and the selling," and silence made room. Outside, sirens idled like engines waiting to decide who they served. The prosecutor laid the ledger like a spine across the table, and the pages breathed with every turned finger. Daniel said, "My confession stands without bargain," and the room measured him against it. Riley said, "Here are the repayments disguised as grants," and the pattern rose like a tide. Marcus said, "I coordinated routes that spared bodies and broke trust," and the admission unlatched a door. Jonah said, "I signed consent under duress," and the word duress rang metallic. Eleanor said, "Consent is the most documented fact here," and her smile arranged itself into symmetry. Ava said, "Documentation is not consent when you edit the memory of risk," and the air sharpened. The judge said, "Proceed," and the court clerk's pen clicked like a metronome for consequence. Riley streamed the receipts, and each upload mapped a corridor through fog. Daniel said. "Ein in the handlers and the corporate shell," and the quiet leaned forward. The ledger stopped feeling like paper and started feeling like gravity deciding where to fall. Recess arrived like a pause that had teeth, and the corridor filled with voices that pretended to be air. Eleanor approached with the ceremony of a coronation that forgot its crown. Eleanor said, "You will exhaust before I yield," and the promise wore silk. Ava said, "I learned to breathe without permission," and her pulse did not hurry. Daniel said, "Your machine is elegant and cruel," and the words refused compliments. Marcus watched the exits and the ceiling cameras and decided he had run out of angles. Riley stepped closer, small as a fuse and twice as certain. Riley said, "You kept a ledger to feel holy," and the sentence held no tremor. Eleanor said, "I kept order where grief would drown you," and the perfume of control thickened. Jonah said, "You kept me," and the syllables refused their cage. The archivist passed between them like a hinge and said, "The copy is at the paper of record," and the corridor blinked away. Somewhere, a printer began to spit the future one page at a time. The verdict did not come that day, but consequence began anyway, and that was a kind of judgment. Ava said, "We go to the garden," and the word garden softened steel without bending it. Daniel said, "I will meet investigators tonight," and the choice settled on his shoulders like weather. Marcus said, "I will testify and accept sanction," and the weight sounded earned. Jonah said, "I will visit the names without hiding," and his eyes made room for light. Riley said, "Anchor becomes ritual," and she carried the sketchbook like a small reliquary. They reached the plaque and the air smelled like clean rain rinsing smoke from a memory that once resisted water. Ava placed the ledger copy beneath the brick and said, "Truth can live here," and the ground felt less haunted. Riley said, "Say his name," and Ava did, and her breath did not break. Somewhere a bell marked an hour that no one owned. The city exhaled, and the wind chose a gentler direction. Night folded over the city, and the diner's neon steadied like a pulse that had chosen life. Daniel said, "Tomorrow the charges formalize," and his voice did not flinch. Marcus said, "I will stand next to you, even when I stand accused," and the line knotted something hard. Jonah said, "I will speak, and then become ordinary," and the wish sounded radical. Riley said, "We built an archive no blade can edit," and the promise felt like architecture. Ava opened the sealed letter she had carried for years, and finally read it without shaking. Jonah's handwriting said, "Live where rescue is not a transaction," and the room expanded. Eleanor's statement played on the television, perfect vowels holding back a flood that had already started. Ava said, "Control is not memory," and she closed the letter with hands that no longer trembled. The neon hummed, and the city listened, and the future stayed uncurated. Riley said, "Anchor holds," and Ava answered, "Only because we do."